I'm fine with all the other lists. As long as I'm not on the Epstein list, we're good, right? How is it that my father can be convicted of 34 crimes, but no one on Epstein's list has even been brought to light? I'm trying to figure out how that's possible, right, folks? It's almost like they're trying to protect those for some reason. I can't imagine why.
It began, as most late-night segments do, with a smirk and a spotlight. Jimmy Kimmel stood before his audience, cracking jokes as he had for years. But this time, something hit differently. Not just because of what he said, but because of who couldn't take it. On the surface, it was classic satire. Don Jr., the former president's eldest son, had just testified in court as part of a $250 million civil fraud trial. Under oath, he called his father an artist with real estate, a phrase so absurd it practically wrote itself into comedy history. Kimmel didn't even need to exaggerate, he just repeated it. One line, one smirk, and somewhere in a room, full of advisors, lawyers, and family loyalists, Donald Trump was no longer laughing. Outside the courthouse, protesters were already chanting "crime family," a phrase that echoed eerily well with what many Americans had begun to feel. Inside, Don Jr. seemed less like a credible witness and more like a punchline in motion. His defense that he wasn't responsible for fraud because he trusted accountants was shaky at best. But it was his delivery, his fumbling, and the sheer confidence behind the ridiculous that gave comedians like Kimmel all the material they could dream of. The reaction from the Trump orbit was immediate and severe. Not in public press releases or official statements, but in behavior. A sense of panic cloaked in bravado, according to sources close to the family. Don Jr. was furious about the way he was portrayed, not in court, but on television. That fury, we would later learn, would escalate beyond media criticism and into attempts to silence the jokes entirely. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A political family that had built its brand on toughness, free speech, and fighting back, now crumbled in the face of a comedian's monologue. A late-night joke had drawn more fire than any policy critique or journalistic expose. Was more than an insult, it was exposure. Moments like these reveal something deeper about the nature of power, that the most dangerous kind is not the one that shouts, but the one that cannot tolerate being laughed at, because to be mocked is to be seen. And for men who've built their empires on myth, laughter is a kind of truth they can't manage. As the crowd inside the studio laughed, another crowd, one with legal teams, PR handlers, and cable news surrogates scrambled. But the unraveling had already begun. And the next step, it didn't just involve damage control, it involved a phone call to Disney. It's one thing to defend your father. It's another to do it under oath, in front of a judge, a jury, and a country still nursing a hangover from his presidency. When Donald Trump Jr. took the stand in the $250 million civil fraud trial against the Trump Organization, expectations were low. But no one predicted that line, the one that would echo across courtrooms, newsrooms, and comedy shows alike. He called his father an artist, with real estate. The phrase hung in the air like bad cologne. It was meant to impress, to elevate Trump's legacy into something refined and masterful. But in a courtroom scrutinizing fraudulent property valuations, calling your father an artist is like calling a forged check a masterpiece. Still, Don Jr. didn't stop there. He painted himself as an innocent bystander, someone who signed off on financial statements but wasn't really involved. He wasn't an accountant, he insisted, just a businessman. He relied on professionals, trusted the experts, didn't ask questions, just like any regular guy. Apparently, in most workplaces, that kind of logic wouldn't fly. Imagine a CEO shrugging off a financial scandal by saying, "I just trusted the numbers someone else gave me." Imagine a surgeon blaming the nurses after a failed operation, or a pilot saying he thought the plane would just fly itself. In court, the absurdity didn't go unnoticed. Lawyers exchanged glances, reporters started drafting headlines, and Jimmy Kimmel, naturally, pounced. He didn't need to twist Don Jr.'s words. Just replaying them was enough to turn the entire moment into a televised spectacle. There's something universally human about watching someone try to sound smarter than they are, and failing. Don Jr. wasn't just defending his father, he was defending a lifestyle, a brand, a myth that had been marketed for decades. But in that courtroom, stripped of teleprompters and friendly anchors, the myth didn't hold. The more he talked, the thinner the foundation became. And yet, beneath the laughter, a quieter truth emerged. When people grow up in power, they often confuse confidence with competence. Don Jr. walked into that courtroom believing that charm, legacy, and a little swagger would carry him through. But the legal system, for all its flaws, doesn't care how many hotels bear your name. It cares what's true. It's the kind of moment that reminds us when the masks fall off. Even the most carefully curated dynasties can unravel with just a few sentences, and just when you thought the defense couldn't get more bizarre, the next act turned it all into a chorus. One fueled by disco lights, AI parodies, and 4 unforgettable letters. TACO sometimes. A nickname is just a joke, and sometimes it becomes a movement. It started quietly, just a whisper among traders. A little acronym passed around like an inside joke. TACO, Trump always chickens out. At first, it was just Wall Street shorthand, a way to vent frustration over Trump's pattern of bold threats followed by sudden retreats. One day he was slapping tariffs on China, the next he was walking them back. One week he was exiting NATO, the next he was promising he never meant it. Investors noticed, and they gave it a name, Taco. But things didn't stay quiet for long. The term reached Jimmy Kimmel's ears. It was no longer a whisper, it became a chorus. He didn't just say it, he sang it. Rewriting the Village People's iconic Macho Man, Kimmel introduced a parody that would echo through internet timelines, protest marches, and maybe even a few family dinners. Taco, Taco Man, I want to be a Taco Man, the audience roared. Not just because it was catchy, but because it felt right. Suddenly, the man once known for fiery speeches and campaign swagger had a new image wrapped in lettuce and dancing to disco. Within days, AI-generated videos flooded social media. Trump in chicken armor, Trump in a taco shell, Trump riding a giant burrito through a 4th of July parade. Memes painted him as El Pollo Loco, the Crunchwrap Supreme Leader. The name stuck not because it was cruel, but because it was true in a way satire often is. Beneath the feathers and fanfare, there was something deeper, something millions of Americans had felt but hadn't yet named. This wasn't strength. It was retreat disguised as bravado, and Trump noticed. He was asked about the nickname by a reporter during a press stop. His face hardened. That's a nasty question, he snapped, before launching into a disjointed rant about national survival and ungrateful weather people. He didn't answer the question, he didn't laugh. He never does when the joke is on him. But that's the thing about comédie. Doesn't need permission. Once a punchline lands, it belongs to the crowd. In that moment, Taco became more than a meme. It became a metaphor, a 4-letter reminder that behind the bombast was a man who flinched when it counted. It turned what could have been a cold political critique into something far more powerful, shared cultural shorthand. And that's the lesson embedded in the joke. Satire doesn't just mock, it simplifies. It distills years of political frustration into one absurd, unforgettable image. And once that image spreads, it's hard to shake, especially when it has a beat. The nickname rattled Trump so deeply, he tried to change the subject. But what came next wasn't just deflection, it was retaliation, because when the laughter didn't stop, the phone rang. And on the other end of that call, Disney, there's getting mad, and then there's picking up the phone to call Mickey Mouse. In 2018, Donald Trump, then the sitting president of the United States, didn't just fume over Jimmy Kimmel's jokes in silence. According to multiple verified reports, including a bombshell piece in Rolling Stone, Trump went further. He directed his White House staff to make not one, but 2 phone calls to Disney executives. Why? To ask them to rein in Jimmy Kimmel. Asterisk. That's right. While managing international tensions, trade wars, and a presidency on the edge of chaos, Trump found time to try and censor a late-night comedian. Not through lawsuits, not through public rebuttals, but by demanding that Disney, parent company of ABC, the network that airs Jimmy Kimmel Live, essentially tell the comedian to stop making fun of him. It sounds like a scene from a political satire, but it really happened. At least 2 senior White House staffers were involved. Their goal? Delivered the president's personal anger over mean monologues and unfair jokes to Disney's top brass. Imagine being an executive at Disney and getting that call. You're expecting updates on the next Star Wars project, and instead you're asked to discipline a talk show host for poking fun at the commander-in-chief. Jimmy's response? Classic Kimmel. In other words, he said on air with a grin, President Karen demanded to speak to my manager. That single line said it all. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. A president trying to silence a comedian isn't just petty, it's authoritarian. In healthy democracies, satire is part of the culture, like town halls and voting booths. It's how people make sense of chaos, and it's how power is kept in check. But Trump didn't laugh. He didn't ignore it either. He wanted it gone. The calls didn't work, of course. Disney never censored Kimmel, but the fact that those calls were made at all is chilling. It raises real questions. What does it mean when the most powerful person in the country sees jokes as threats? And what happens when comedy starts getting treated like sedition? For viewers at home, it wasn't just hilarious. It was revealing. A man who had once bragged about his tough skin, who had called journalists the enemy of the people, now crumbled over a late-night punchline. There's a lesson here about power, not just the kind written in laws, but the kind people carry in their voice. Jimmy didn't have an army, he had a microphone, and apparently that was enough to shake the White House. But satire has a way of bouncing back stronger than any press release. And after those calls failed to silence Jimmy, something surprising happened. Trump didn't back down, he doubled down. And this time, the story didn't involve phone calls. It involved diapers, disco, and a campaign trying to outrun a parody it could no longer control. In a country built on free expression, the right to make fun of those in power isn't just a privilege, it's a pillar. And when a president tries to silence a late-night comedian with phone calls to a media company, That pillar starts to shake. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution is one of the most cherished lines ever written into law. It guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to criticize the government, yes, even through sarcasm, songs, and sketches. Nowhere does it say that speech must be polite. Nowhere does it say the president gets to veto a punchline. That's what made Trump's Disney directive so unsettling. When a sitting president pressures a private media company to censor a critic, especially one using satire, it brushes dangerously close to violating that very amendment. It may not be illegal in the narrowest sense, but it reeks of something. Americans have long rejected state-influenced speech control. Throughout history, satire has served as a mirror held up to power. From Mark Twain's political jabs to Saturday Night Live's presidential impressions, comedy has always helped the public digest difficult truths. It's a release valve, a way to say what others are too afraid to say. And, in many cases, it's the first thing authoritarian regimes try to ban. Think about it. In Russia, comedians who mock the president disappear from the airwaves. In Turkey, satirists have been jailed. In China, political jokes are wiped from the internet within hours. Those are places where the state fears laughter, because laughter signals understanding. It breaks the illusion. It brings people together around a shared truth. That's why what Jimmy Kimmel did mattered far beyond the laughs. His monologues became more than jokes. They became proof that the system still worked, even when its most powerful member tried to bend the rules to drive the point home. Legal scholars weighed in. Professor Lawrence Tribe, one of the country's foremost constitutional experts, put it bluntly in an interview. At the time, if the president uses his office to intimidate private citizens into silence, we have a much bigger problem than bad jokes. And that's the lesson to carry forward. Satire isn't dangerous because it insults. It's dangerous because it exposes. It peels away the branding, the slogans, the carefully curated images, and reveals the insecurities underneath. And when the most powerful man in the country reacts not with argument, but with censorship, it proves that the joke landed exactly where it should. Of course, Trump wasn't done trying to control the story, because as Jimmy kept joking, the nickname kept spreading. And what happened next wasn't about the Constitution or phone calls. It was about a promise, a 2-week promise, one that never seemed to end. In politics, timing is everything. But for Donald Trump, timing often meant something strangely familiar. 2 weeks. If you followed his presidency closely, you started to notice a pattern. Whether it was healthcare reform, a trade deal with China, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, or an answer about Vladimir Putin, everything was always coming. In 2 weeks, the phrase became so frequent, it stopped sounding like a deadline and started feeling like a reflex. Reporters would ask hard questions, and, without fail, Trump would respond, "We'll have something on that in 2 weeks. No date, no specifics, just 2 weeks. And then, silence. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't the only one to catch it, but he made it unforgettable. In one segment, he ran a full montage of Trump promising dozens of decisions, all supposedly arriving within 2 weeks. It played like a broken jukebox. Healthcare, 2 weeks. Infrastructure, 2 weeks. North Korea strategy, 2 weeks. Spoiler alert, none of it came in 2 weeks. At first, it seemed like a quirk, a stalling tactic, but over time, it morphed into something bigger, a kind of unofficial doctrine. When you can't deliver, you delay. When people demand answers, you dangle a promise. You buy time. You confuse the calendar. And in the meantime, people wait. Investors stall. Allies hesitate. Citizens lose trust. That it may have sounded harmless, even comical, but the cost was very real. Policies were shelved, plans abandoned, and confidence eroded. In one especially costly instance, Trump delayed key decisions in the middle of escalating trade tensions with China, promising announcements in 2 weeks while the market spiraled. By the end of that quarter, economists estimated the country had lost over $6 trillion in market value. That's not funny. That's devastating. For those watching at home, the lesson was clear. Indecision isn't neutral, it's a decision in itself. And when it comes from the highest office in the land, that decision can ripple through every corner of American life. Jimmy's satire worked because it took something subtle and gave it shape. 2 weeks stopped being a vague excuse and became a symbol, a warning sign that promises without plans are just placeholders, no matter how confidently they're delivered. And if Trump's policies seemed elusive, his economic consequences were about to become unavoidable. Because while he was promising action, prices were climbing, tariffs were spreading, and the cost of living, it was about to hit home. It's easy to dismiss a president's tantrum over a late-night joke, but when that same president starts launching economic policies with the same level of impulse, the consequences aren't just personal, they're national. Donald Trump's presidency often felt like a string of improvisations. One day it was a tweet about China, then next it was a surprise tariff. No roadmap, no coordination, just fire and fury, and sometimes a complete reversal. 2 weeks later, the trade war with China became the clearest example. It began with bold declarations that America was being ripped off and that he alone could fix it. Tariffs were slapped on steel, aluminum, washing machines, solar panels, everything from construction materials to home appliances. And in response, China fired back with their own tariffs, hitting American farmers, automakers, and manufacturers. Prices surged. Projects stalled. Small businesses floundered. One furniture maker in North Carolina, Fiona, to lay off a third of its workforce after the price of imported materials doubled. A soybean farmer in Iowa saw nearly his entire harvest rot in silos because Chinese buyers vanished. A single mom in Ohio suddenly found that replacing her broken washing machine would cost $300 more than it did a year before. Jimmy Kimmel captured the absurdity with a line that stuck. He's not stopping the steal, he's stopping the steal. From being affordable beneath the humor was a harsh truth. The joke-free presidency, the one that couldn't tolerate being laughed at, also couldn't take criticism, couldn't admit error, and couldn't pivot when it mattered most. And so, instead of fixing problems, it multiplied them. With every new tariff came a new ripple effect, and with every economic stumble came a new excuse. It wasn't just about bad math. It was about bad leadership, a refusal to listen, a belief that bluster was a plan. The real cost of this presidency wasn't just felt in tax returns or store receipt, it was felt in the slow erosion of stability. Trust in government dipped. Allies questioned America's reliability. Markets trembled. The country that once led global economics with confidence now felt reactive, defensive, and unpredictable. And while Trump was busy trying to silence jokes on television, he couldn't silence the numbers. The economy, once strong, became fragile. Not because of sabotage or crisis, but because of ego. And the irony, the very thing he feared most being mocked, was what people turned to just to stay sane. Because when diapers start trending, and satire starts sounding like news, it's a sign the old rules no longer apply. And that's exactly where the internet stepped in with memes, music, and AI-powered parody. What came next wasn't policy, it was pop culture. And it didn't just bite, it danced. The White House may have had phone calls, press conferences, and carefully worded statements. But the internet had memes. And it was merciless. As Trump fumed over Jimmy Kimmel's monologues, and stewed over the rising popularity of the nickname Taco, the digital world responded in a way no administration could control. With AI tools becoming more accessible than ever, users from every corner of the political spectrum began to generate parodies that went far beyond a late-night joke. Suddenly, images of Trump in full chicken armor flooded TikTok. Twitter threads rebranded him as the Crunchwrap Supreme Leader. There were deepfake videos of him dancing in a taco costume at campaign rallies, giving speeches from the Oval Office while feathers popped out of his suit sleeves. Even a fake infomercial for Taco Trump. Tuesdays all built with a few clicks and a lot of imagination, and the thing was, they didn't just go viral. They stuck. Because while traditional media still debated whether something was offensive or presidential, the internet simply laughed and shared. It didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for fact-checkers. It responded instantly, visually, and creatively. One TikTok parody of Trump singing Taco Man hit over 12 million views in 48 hours. That kind of reach isn't just humorous, it's cultural. It becomes shorthand, a way for millions of people to process, resist, and ridicule a leader who seemed increasingly out of touch and increasingly unable to take a joke. Some Trump supporters tried to fight back, calling it disrespectful or digital bullying. One right-wing influencer tweeted, "This is meme warfare. It's psychological sabotage." But the genie was already out of the bottle. When power can't control the narrative, humor often does. And that's the beauty end. Modern satire? It doesn't need a studio. It doesn't wait for airtime. It flows in real time, from bedrooms and college dorms, from bored teens and frustrated voters. And in a world where politics often feels scripted, these chaotic, colorful, wildly creative memes felt alive. Beneath the feathers, filters, and funny voices, the internet was saying something serious. We see through you. You can control the room, but not the conversation. And when the people decide they're done being talked down to, they start talking back with Photoshop, rhythm, and the occasional chicken nugget crown. Still, Trump didn't stop trying to control the message. Because while the internet was laughing, he was planning his comeback. And the clearest sign of that wasn't in a meme, it was in the way he turned every moment of mockery into fuel for his next appearance, his next speech, and, ultimately, his next outburst. And that outburst, it was coming soon. But this time it wasn't about comedy, it was personal. And it came dressed in power. Every president brings a piece of themselves into the job. Some lead with vision, some with policy, some with quiet strength. Donald Trump led with ego. From the very beginning, his presidency was defined less by strategy and more by spectacle. Press briefings turned into performances. Cabinet meetings became loyalty contests. And every insult, no matter how small, felt like a threat that demanded retaliation. Not just from critics, but from comedians, late-night hosts, athletes, journalists, even the weather. What made Trump's leadership so unpredictable wasn't just his policies. It was the way his personal insecurities bled into public power. A joke wasn't just a joke, it was war. A nickname like Taco wasn't satire, it was sabotage. And when Jimmy Kimmel poked fun at him, the White House didn't laugh. It made phone calls. Psychologists have a name for this kind of behavior: narcissistic injury. When someone with a fragile sense of self feels exposed, even slightly, they overreact. They lash out, not just to restore dignity but to reassert control. And in the case of a president, that overreaction doesn't stay private. It echoes through markets, through policy, through press rooms. It shows up in executive orders, tariff decisions, and angry midnight tweets. There was a moment during a rally one that captured this perfectly, when Trump, still bitter about a joke Kimmel had made months earlier at the Oscars, turned to the crowd and ranted, "Has there ever been a worse host than Jimmy Kimmel?" The audience was quiet, not because they disagreed, but because they didn't understand why that was still on his mind. In the middle of economic turmoil, global crises, and rising costs at home, the leader of the free world was obsessing over a man with a microphone and a punchline. And that's the danger. When personal grievance drives national agenda, everything, it starts to feel smaller. The office shrinks to fit the man, instead of the man rising to meet the office. But the public notices. They always do. Jimmy didn't fight back with lawsuits or angry monologues. He didn't even raise his voice. He smiled, thanked Trump for watching, and joked about bedtime. And in that quiet response, something landed harder than any insult. Grace under pressure. Humor over heat. Because ego might shout, but dignity lingers. Still, as Trump's outbursts grew louder and his attempts to silence satire failed, a larger truth emerged. This wasn't just about two men trading jabs, it was about something much bigger: the role of humor in democracy, and what happens when laughter is treated like rebellion. There's a reason comedians are often the first to be silenced in dictatorships. It's not because they shout the loudest, or because they hold office. It's because they notice what others are trained to ignore and they say it out loud, with a smile. In a healthy democracy, laughter isn't a distraction, it's a compass. It points us toward the uncomfortable truths wrapped in absurdity, the contradictions hiding beneath polished speeches. That's what Jimmy Kimmel did. That's what satire does when it's doing its job. He didn't claim to be a policymaker, or a journalist, or a revolutionary. He was a comedian. But somehow, his monologues about Don Jr.'s courtroom contradictions, Trump's 2-week delay tactics, and the taco meme reached deeper than any political ad ever could. Because they didn't tell people what to think, they gave people permission to see. And seeing is powerful. It reminds us that the emperor's suit might just be a chicken costume, that the man shouting fake news is most afraid of being exposed by a joke he can't control, and that when leadership forgets how to laugh, it usually means the people are laughing at them, not with them. The lesson here isn't that comedy fixes everything. It doesn't, but it defends something sacred: the space to question, to mock, to challenge the myth of untouchable power. In that space, democracy breathes. That's what makes the punchline so important. It isn't just about the laugh, it's about who gets to speak, who gets to respond, and what happens when someone in power tries to shut it all down. Jimmy Kimmel never asked to be a symbol of free speech. He just wanted to tell a few jokes at the end of a long day. But when the jokes hit too close, and the president tried to shut them down, the audience showed up not just to laugh, but to listen. And in the end, that's what this whole story has been about. Not just courtroom testimony or AI memes or disco parodies. It's been about power, and what it fears most. Because in a world full of spin, the truest sound might just be the one that gets you to laugh and then think. And if one late-night host with a monologue and a smirk can make a president rattle, then maybe the real question isn't why he joked, but why it worked. In the end, what started as a simple joke became a spotlight on something much deeper: the fragility of unchecked power. From Don Jr.'s courtroom stumbles to Trump's obsession with being mocked, from parody songs to meme warfare. This wasn't just about laughs, it was about accountability. And it reminded us that in a free society, satire doesn't destroy nations, it protects them. Because when leaders fear punchlines more than policies, we all need to keep listening, keep questioning, and yes, keep laughing. Thank you for watching. If you found this story insightful, funny, or thought-provoking, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs a laugh. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that dive deep beneath the headlines. Until next time, stay sharp, stay free, and we'll see you in the next one.